I'm Liam.
I'm Wayne,
You're listening to In Film We Trust YouTube.
a place where we post clips from our recent episode.
All links down below in the description.
And now, on with the show.
So this is a bit of a departure from our usual topics, isn't it?
It does seem left field, but it kind of carries on in that kind of independent spirit, doesn't it? Because this is very independent, this film.
Very much so. Yeah, this is more than any other film we've done before. This has the most indie spirit, I think, if you can put it like that.
Because that happened in the 90s, and there's this term, the 90s indie boom.
Yeah.
It kind of flourished from Sundance Film Festival. But in fact, the groundwork for that was laid far before that, because you had John Cassavetes in the 70s,
Yes.
who would remortgage his house just to make a film.
Just make a film.
His films were character studies about life. There
Yeah.
weren't genre fare, because there's always been genre films made on the cheap, hasn't there?
Yeah, but if you go back to the 70s was the director-driven films. When you had the new wave of Hollywood, and you had your Coppolas and you had your Scorseses and your Maliks and your Caminos, who were making these movies which were much more influenced by, I'd say, like personal ambitions rather than what the studio wanted to do.
Well, that's the thing as well. In the 70s, you would have these types of films, whether it was Five Easy Pieces with Jack Nicholson, or films of this nature, but they would be studio financed.
Yes.
Because in the 70s, when they had this term, the auteur-driven driven cinema, you would get these personal pictures where the studio would finance, and what you term now as a big budget film would have been essentially a B movie until Jaws pretty much changed that.
Yeah, because Jaws invented what we call now the blockbuster, because they had, lines around the block. But back then, yeah, it was still, in terms of now, not just with inflation, but budgets have gone up so much nowadays. But back then, yeah, you were making movies for less than $1 million.
This kind of Jaws influence carried on to the 80s, because you had all the Spielberg films, the continuation of Star Wars, and you had all this big budget fare. But on the opposite end of that, you had a real starting period of independent cinema, didn't you?
You'd argue that the 80s were more of a studio decade, but you still had a lot of these independent movies which were like kind of creeping along the bottom.
Well, you had She's Gotta Have It by Spike Lee, which was made for $175.
Yeah, and then he capped off the decade with was it Do the Right Thing?
Do the Right Thing, but that was
more of a studio film.
Picture. You would find this as the 90s came along, this kind of independently financed cinema would take hold and become more of a cultural impact, because you had the influence of Sundance Film Festival, where I think did Sex, Lies and Videotape not premiere there?
The Steven Soderbergh film. Yes,
yeah.
Soderbergh is very much one of the first names that when you do research about independent films, his is one of the first names to come up, because Sex, Lies and Videotape. But then later on, what happened in the 2000s is people who made their name in independent films were brought into studio films. Like he went on to do the Oceans trilogy, for example.
Well, you found that even as the 90s gone on. Even you had Reservoir Dogs with Tarantino.
Yeah, that was, when I was doing research, that and Pulp Fiction really changed the independent movie landscape.
Well, Pulp Fiction's not actually an independent film.
No, Miramax.
Because Miramax in 93 was bought out by Disney.
It was a subsidiary.
A subsidiary, yeah. And so Pulp Fiction, it's operating on an independent feel, isn't it?
Very much so.
But you're getting to a grey area now if you call Pulp Fiction independent.
Yeah, when you look back at it now, it's in ways it does feel kind of like a studio film. You have all the logos and stuff over it, but at the time, because in the 90s these independent films were such a big thing. Yeah, Miramax came along and they had a real winner on their hands.
And what is interesting about independent film, because you're working with a far lower budget, you can take more risks.
You can, yes.
You had a movement called the New Queer Cinema Movement, which would introduce Gus Van Sant, Greg Araki, filmmakers of that ilk.
Yes. Yeah, basically people who were coming along and telling stories they wanted to tell. Because my theory with the 90s is a lot of people who made independent films then, they were kids in the 70s and they'll have seen these movies which really influenced them. And then when they came of age, it was the 90s and it was their turn. So they would go out and take their crappy home movie camera and they wanted to make their own films.
And what it actually shows is a more authentic view of marginalized groups, doesn't it?
It does, because it was a lot more intimate and it was much more, like you say, like on the home front. You weren't making big studio blockbusters. It was very much what was happening at home or what was happening in the communities.
And that ties into like Swingers. Swingers is a film where on the surface it can seem quite a generic plot.
Yes.
But the way it is made and the way it is handled, whether it's the documentary style look of it, it has a very documentary style look.
For me, the film wasn't, I don't know if you felt this way, it wasn't so much about plot, it was more about character and interaction, I felt.
Which I think a lot of independent cinema is. You're doing away with plot and it to give the audience an understanding of a people and place.
You could say, I felt it was almost like a stream of conscience. It's like basically the film is just going to follow along with these people on their lives. It's not, we have to get from A to B. It's like, we'll spend a bit of time here and we'll just kind of, these people just hanging out with their mates and have all of this discussion, then it'll kind of flow on. So I think, like I say, less plot driven, more character and interaction driven, I felt.
Technically, given the simplistic type plot of Swingers is a film what could have easily been made in the whole frat pack movie, but it would have been a completely different film.
I see what you mean. Well, Vince Vaughn was in the frat pack.
Yeah. The way this is particularly made would not have been made in the 2000s. The main character would have been far less pessimistic throughout. It would have been very stereotypical.
It would almost felt like more of kind of like a hero's journey, like he's going to learn these life lessons and he's going to go on to win the day kind of thing.
And he'd probably be a dopey, likeable fella.
Yeah. There are elements of that in here, but I think it's dialed down so it's more realistic. It feels more like an actual personality rather than these quirks are added in to be identifiable, I think.
And from there, you have, like, in independent cinema, you have personal films from Gus Van Sant, My Own Private Idaho.
Good film.
Probably my favourite of the entire 90s indie boom. Have you saw My Own Private Idaho?
Yeah, I like Private Idaho. It's been a while since I've seen it. The thing that stuck out for me was River Phoenix's performance, which was just fantastic.
Oh, he was a tremendous talent.
He was tremendous, yeah. Taken way too soon. Yeah, I think for me, other films like Boogie Nights is another one. In the Company of Men. What else? Did you ever see Kids?
Larry Clark?
Yeah.
Written by Harmony Korine, yeah.
Harmony Korine, yeah.
It's a great film.
Very controversial film, but yes, again, feels very much like, again, not much plot, more kind of following characters around.
And I don't think you could talk about 90s indie without Kevin Smith, Clerks.
Kevin Smith, Clerks, yeah, which he... If that movie hadn't succeeded because he borrowed money from his parents, he maxed out his credit cards, if that movie hadn't done well, that would have ruined him, wouldn't it?
And Clerks was actually an influence on Swingers.
It does look like it, doesn't it? Because, again, it's the same thing we're dealing with, just character interactions.
Because when Jon Favreau was trying to get this film made, they were looking to sell it for a budget of about 1.5 million.
Which would have been kind of standard.
But when Doug Liman came on to direct it, he said, look, we don't need to pretend we're making a feature film. By making a feature film, we're making a feature film, regardless of how it looks.